You're about to discover why ancient justice was never meant to be fair. It was designed to make sure you never forgot what happens when you cross the line. When we hear the word justice today, we think of fairness, balance, due process, a chance to change. But for most of human history, justice had nothing to do with rehabilitation. It had everything to do with survival. The methods ancient societies used weren't accidents. They were calculated strategies designed to control behavior, designed to maintain order, and disturbingly effective. This is not a story about cruelty. This is a story about power, fear, and a system that understood human behavior better than we like to admit. Because what ancient civilizations discovered thousands of years ago still echoes through our courtrooms today. The tools have changed, the psychology hasn't, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Part 1. What we call justice today. Today, when someone breaks the law, we arrest them, we hold trials, we assign sentences, we debate fairness, bias, and reform. We argue about whether prisons help or harm. We built modern justice around the idea that punishment should be measured and humane. We have public defenders and appeal processes. We have constitutional protections and international human rights standards. We've created entire branches of government dedicated to ensuring justice is blind, balanced, and proportional. But this idea is new, extremely new. For most of history, justice was not about second chances. It was about sending a message so clear that nobody would test it twice. When ancient societies said justice, they meant certainty, visibility, permanence. Because in a world without police departments, prison systems, or centralized enforcement, justice had to work instantly. It had to be undeniable. It had to be unforgettable. And it was. Think about what modern justice requires. Investigators, forensic teams, lawyers, judges, juries, years of appeals, billions of dollars in infrastructure, thousands of laws and precedents. We've built an entire industry around the idea that punishment should be fair. Ancient societies had none of this. No databases, no fingerprinting, no DNA evidence, no surveillance cameras, no way to track someone across borders or verify their identity. If you committed a crime in one city and fled to another, you essentially became a new person. So how do you maintain order in a world like that? How do you stop theft when you can't prove who stole? How do you prevent violence when witnesses can disappear? How do you enforce laws when enforcement itself is nearly impossible? You make the punishment so severe, so public, so memorable that the risk becomes unthinkable. You don't just punish the criminal, you create a spectacle that burns itself into the collective memory of everyone watching. This is not a story about cruelty. This is a story about power, fear, and a system that understood human behavior better than we like to admit. Part 2. Why ancient justice was harsh. Ancient societies were not harsh because they enjoyed suffering. They were harsh because they had limited tools. There were no national databases, no border tracking, no surveillance, no prisons capable of holding thousands of people long-term. If someone committed a crime and escaped, they could vanish into another settlement and start over. So punishment had to happen fast, it had to happen publicly, and it had to create a permanent memory. Public enforcement was not random, it was strategic. The punishment was not only for the offender, it was for everyone watching. You did not need to break the law to learn the lesson, you only needed to witness the consequence. Ancient justice was not built to reform individuals, it was built to shape crowds. Consider the economic reality. Maintaining a prison population requires resources, food, guards, facilities, security. In societies where famine was common and resources were scarce, long-term imprisonment was a luxury most communities couldn't afford. Execution, mutilation, or exile were cheaper, faster, more definitive. A thief who lost a hand could never steal again. A traitor who was publicly executed could never betray again. An exile could never threaten the community again. But the real genius wasn't just in the efficiency, it was in the psychological impact. When punishment happened in the town square, when entire communities gathered to witness justice, something powerful occurred. The punishment transcended the individual. It became a shared experience, a collective warning, a cultural memory. Children watched, merchants watched, Farmers watched, soldiers watched, and they all learned the same lesson simultaneously. This is what happens when you break our rules. This is the price of disorder. This is why you obey. The punishment didn't need to happen often, it just needed to happen memorably. One brutal execution could prevent 100 future crimes. One public humiliation could deter 1,000 potential offenders. Ancient lawmakers understood diminishing returns. If punishment was too common, it lost impact. People became desensitized. The spectacle became routine. So justice had to be rare enough to remain shocking, but consistent enough to remain credible. This created a delicate balance. Too much mercy and the system collapsed into chaos. Too much brutality and the population rebelled. Ancient justice walked a razor's edge between order and tyranny. Part 3. The psychology of fear-based law. And this is where ancient justice becomes psychologically dangerous. Fear works, not ethically, not ideally, but historically and practically, fear-based systems created obedience when nothing else could. In societies without written law, formal courts, or appeals processes, how do you enforce rules? You make the consequences impossible to forget. You make punishment visible, immediate, symbolic. Ancient lawmakers understood something uncomfortable. People do not always obey laws because they are moral. They obey laws because they fear consequences. In a world without long-term incarceration, fear became the only tool that scaled across large populations. But once leaders understood that fear controls behavior, a new question emerged. Where does justice end and manipulation begin? Because fear is a primitive emotion. It bypasses rational thought. It triggers survival instincts. When you witness something traumatic, your brain doesn't analyze whether the punishment was proportional or fair. It simply records danger. It creates an association. Crime equals suffering. Disobedience equals pain. This is classical conditioning on a societal scale. The same principles that make a dog flinch at a raised hand work on human populations. Repeated exposure to violent consequences creates automatic behavioral responses. You don't choose to obey, you feel compelled to obey. Ancient societies weaponized this psychology. They understood that human beings are pattern recognition machines. We see cause and effect. We extrapolate from examples. We learn from observation. Show a population what happens to thieves, and theft rates drop. Show them what happens to traitors, and loyalty increases. Show them what happens to rebels, and rebellion becomes unthinkable. But there's a darker layer. Fear-based systems don't just prevent crime. They prevent questioning. They prevent innovation. They prevent dissent of any kind. Because once fear becomes the primary motivator, people stop distinguishing between harmful actions and harmless differences. The same fear that prevents murder also prevents free speech. The same fear that stops theft also stops political organizing. The same fear that maintains order also maintains oppression. And ancient rulers knew this, and they counted on it. Because a population controlled by fear is a population that never challenges authority. Part 4. How civilizations applied this logic. These examples are presented for historical understanding, not endorsement. In ancient Rome, public punishment served more than law enforcement. It reinforced imperial authority. Rome ruled over millions of conquered people with different cultures and loyalties. Visible justice reminded everyone who controlled the system. The Roman arena wasn't just entertainment, it was political theater. Criminals and prisoners were executed in elaborate spectacles that demonstrated Roman power. Gladiatorial combat showed that Rome controlled life and death. Exotic animals from distant provinces proved Roman reach extended everywhere. Mass executions demonstrated what happened to those who resisted Roman rule. Citizens attended these events by the thousands. The Colosseum held 50,000 people. Entire communities gathered to watch justice unfold. And the message was unmistakable. Rome is powerful. Rome is absolute. Rome is inevitable. In China, justice was tied to moral order. Confucian philosophy viewed social disorder as cosmic imbalance. Punishment was seen as restoring harmony, not simply punishing individuals.
When someone committed a crime, they didn't just break a law, they disrupted the natural order of society. Chinese justice often extended beyond the individual. Family members could be punished for one person's crime. This created a system of mutual surveillance where everyone had an incentive to ensure their relatives obeyed the law. Your father's crime could result in your execution. Your brother's betrayal could destroy your family's status for generations. This wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. By making punishment collective, Chinese law created millions of informal enforcers. Every family became responsible for policing itself. Social pressure replaced the need for extensive law enforcement. In Persia, loyalty was everything. Betrayal was treated as an existential threat to the empire. Persian justice targeted not only actions, but legacy and reputation. Persian rulers understood that death alone wasn't sufficient deterrent for those willing to die for their cause. So Persian justice attacked legacy. Traitors were not just executed, their names were erased from records, their property was seized, their families were scattered, their very existence was wiped from history. This created a fate worse than death, total obliteration. In tribal societies, centralized authority did not exist. Justice was personal and honor-based. Failing to respond to wrongdoing was seen as weakness. Weakness invited more conflict. If someone killed your family member and you didn't seek revenge, other tribes viewed your group as vulnerable, easy targets. This created cycles of retribution that could last generations, blood feuds where each act of revenge justified the next. Justice wasn't about restoring order, it was about demonstrating strength, proving your tribe couldn't be victimized without consequences. Different cultures, different philosophies, different methods.
Part 5. When justice became control. This is the moment justice stopped protecting society and started protecting power. What began as a survival strategy slowly became a tool of domination. Rulers realized something dangerous. You did not need people to break the law. You only needed them to fear that they could be accused. Speech became treason. Questioning authority became heresy. Gathering became conspiracy. The law shifted from protecting communities to protecting regimes. Punishment was no longer reserved for real harm. It was used to eliminate opposition and silence threats. Justice became a weapon. And people still watched. They still feared. They still obeyed. Because fear does not require truth. It only requires belief. This is where ancient justice reveals its darkest potential. Once you establish that severe punishment prevents crime, you create a tool that can be used for any purpose. The same mechanism that stops murder can stop criticism. The same fear that prevents theft can prevent free thought. Historical records show this pattern repeating across civilizations. Leaders who initially used harsh justice to maintain order gradually expanded the definition of crime to include anything that threatened their power. In Rome, treason laws originally targeted those who betrayed the state in wartime, but emperors expanded the definition until simply criticizing the emperor became treason. Speaking ill of imperial policy, failing to show proper respect, even private conversations could be prosecuted if someone reported you. In medieval Europe, heresy laws started as protection against religious threats, but they evolved into tools for eliminating political rivals. Accuse someone of heresy, and you could seize their property, destroy their reputation, eliminate them entirely. No proof required beyond testimony from witnesses who might themselves be coerced. The Inquisition understood this perfectly. The threat of investigation was often more powerful than actual prosecution. People censored themselves. They avoided controversial topics. They informed on neighbors to prove their own loyalty. Fear created a surveillance state where everyone monitored everyone else. In China, during various dynasties, literary inquisitions targeted scholars whose writings could be interpreted as critical, not openly rebellious, just potentially interpretable as questioning authority. Thousands were executed not for what they said, but for what authorities claimed they might have meant. This is the inevitable endpoint of fear-based justice.
Once established as legitimate, it expands to cover everything those in power want to control. The infrastructure of justice becomes the infrastructure of oppression, and populations conditioned to obey through fear cannot distinguish between legitimate law enforcement and authoritarian abuse. Because the mechanisms look identical: public trials, confessions, punishments. The only difference is the accusation. And if you've been taught to fear the system rather than trust it, you can't challenge accusations without becoming suspect yourself. Part 6. The collapse of old justice systems. So why did these systems begin to fall apart? Not because humanity suddenly became kinder, but because the world changed. Populations grew, cities expanded, trade networks connected empires, people moved between regions and cultures. Fear alone could no longer control complex societies. Philosophers questioned whether punishment should exist for pain or reform. Religious movements promoted redemption. Enlightenment thinkers demanded rational legal systems. Global pressure forced empires to adopt standards that appeared civilized and modern. Public punishment faded, but the logic did not disappear. The practical limitations became obvious. In a small village where everyone knew everyone, public punishment worked. Social pressure reinforced legal pressure. Reputation mattered. Shame mattered. Witnesses knew the accused personally. But in cities with hundreds of thousands of people, anonymity emerged. You could witness a punishment and forget it by the next day. You could commit a crime in one district and be unknown in another. The intimate social control of small communities broke down. Trade created another problem. Merchants traveling between regions needed predictable legal standards. A trader couldn't operate effectively if every city had wildly different punishments for the same offense. Commercial growth demanded consistency, standardization, eventually codification. International relations added pressure. Empires competing for influence started using human rights as diplomatic weapons, criticizing rivals for brutal punishments while claiming moral superiority. This created incentives to appear enlightened, whether or not actual practices changed. The printing press accelerated everything. Legal laws became accessible. Legal precedents could be referenced and compared. Contradictions became visible. Arbitrary punishments could be documented and challenged. Information broke the monopoly authorities had on defining justice. Enlightenment philosophy provided intellectual framework. Thinkers like Caesarea Beccaria argued that certainty of punishment deterred crime more effectively than severity, that brutal punishments brutalized society itself, that justice should be proportional, rational, and focused on prevention rather than revenge. These ideas spread through educated classes, gradually influenced policy. Reform movements emerged demanding prison systems over execution, rehabilitation over mutilation, due process over arbitrary judgment. But here's what's crucial. The transition wasn't driven by moral awakening. It was driven by practical necessity and political competition. Ancient justice didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because it stopped working in the modern world.
Part 7. Modern justice still uses the same logic. This is the uncomfortable part. We believe we have outgrown ancient justice, but the foundation remains. We no longer punish in public squares, but we broadcast trials globally. We no longer mark people physically, but we attach permanent records that follow them through life. We no longer exile criminals to wilderness, but we isolate them from society for decades. The tools changed. The psychology did not. We still use fear. We still use public consequence. We still send messages through punishment. And just like ancient societies, we justify it by calling it necessary. Think about modern criminal records. A conviction doesn't just result in prison time. It creates a permanent digital mark that affects employment, housing, education, voting rights. In some jurisdictions, criminal records are publicly searchable. Anyone can look up your past. This is the modern version of physical branding. The mark is digital instead of literal, but the function is identical. Permanent identification, social exclusion, limited opportunity, a constant reminder to the individual and warning to others. Consider media coverage of trials. High-profile cases are broadcast live, analyzed continuously, dissected by experts. The accused is photographed, investigated, discussed endlessly. Their lives are torn apart in public. Even if acquitted, their reputation is destroyed. This is public punishment. The spectacle has moved from town squares to television screens, but the mechanism is the same. We gather as a society to witness justice, to see consequences, to learn what happens when you cross certain lines. Sex offender registries take this further. Public databases with names, photos, addresses, permanent tracking, community notification when someone moves nearby. This is exile reimagined, not physical removal from society, but social isolation within it. And we justify it the same way ancient societies did: public safety, deterrence, protection. The same arguments that justified public execution now justify permanent surveillance. Mandatory minimum sentences eliminate judicial discretion, just like ancient codes did. The punishment is predetermined, automatic, inevitable. This creates the certainty that deters crime, but it also removes the ability to consider individual circumstances, context, or potential for reform. Three strikes laws permanently remove repeat offenders from society. This is modern exile. Instead of banishing people to wilderness, we banish them to prisons. The result is the same: permanent removal. Even rehabilitation programs reveal ancient logic. We say we're reforming criminals, but what are we reforming them into? Obedient citizens, people who follow rules, who fear consequences, who internalize social control. We're just doing it through therapy instead of torture. The language changed, the goals didn't. Ancient societies wanted compliant populations. Modern societies want compliant populations. We've just convinced ourselves our methods are more humane. Final monologue. Ancient justice was not broken. It worked exactly as designed. It created order where chaos could destroy communities. It enforced rules where no institutions existed. It held fragile societies together. But it also taught humanity something permanent: that fear is effective, that punishment shapes behavior, that control can be disguised as justice. Even today, we carry that logic forward. The real question is not whether ancient justice was too harsh. The real question is whether any system built on fear can ever be truly just. And if the answer is no, then we must ask what that says about the justice systems we still defend today. Because we've inherited more than we've changed. We've refined the tools, but kept the foundation. We've softened the appearance, but maintained the mechanism. We've modernized punishment while preserving its essential purpose. Ancient societies used fear because they had to. They lacked alternatives. They needed immediate compliance in survival situations. But we have alternatives. We have resources. We have knowledge. We have options they never imagined. Yet we still default to punishment, still rely on fear, still believe that suffering prevents future suffering. We've had centuries to imagine something different, to build systems based on restoration instead of retribution, on prevention instead of punishment, on transformation instead of trauma. But we haven't. Not really. We've made cosmetic changes while preserving the core belief that justice requires harm, that order requires fear, that safety requires suffering. Maybe ancient justice wasn't the problem. Maybe it was just the most honest version of something we've never actually moved beyond. They punished in public because they believed visibility was necessary. We punish in private, but ensure everyone knows it happened. They marked bodies, we mark records. They exiled to wilderness, we exiled to cells. Different methods, same message. Cross this line and you will suffer. Obey or face consequences. Fear us and you'll be safe. And perhaps that's the real legacy of ancient justice. Not the brutality, not the spectacle, not even the suffering, but the belief that justice and fear are inseparable, that you cannot have order without threat, that society requires some people to suffer so others feel secure. Ancient civilizations believed this because their world made it seem true. What's our excuse?